Hello everyone. Today we will be discussing user access and role management. This also introduces you into the basics of security. And so I created a very simple application with a username and a password. And if the login is wrong, it just refreshes the page. So it looks like this. And then if the right details are put in, then it will go through. This is the very basic, so I didn't implement forget password or fancy security algorithms, just a basic introduction. So what happens is, if I type in the username that is right, then it goes to the next screen, and this comes from the previous homework that I just edited. So this does authentication, where it sends a token to this screen that is validated, and then when you click on details, it also authenticates it by sending a token. The token we use is a GUID, which you'll learn more about a little bit later. So from a database perspective, the database looks like this. So I just created a diagram quickly. So this is the old database from the previous homework or previous video, and I just added two tables, user and user type. So user type is the role management, so you can be admin, or you can be super user, or whatever it might be. And then user is a user email, a user password, a user type that links to that, a GUID and a GUID expiry. So the rule we've also implemented is that if the user is logged in for more than 30 minutes without a call from the database, then with the next request logged out. So if we look at the types, the GUID is just a varchar 100, and the rest look like this. The user password is varchar max, because if it is encrypted, it becomes very long. Alright, so I'm just going to go through the code, because there's a lot to go through, and I'll explain what everything does. So I'd like to start with the index page. So this is the first page you see, and then I added HTML, which has two input fields, a username and a password, and then the submit button, login, and just another button for forgot password. So if you want to be more secure, you should encrypt the password before you send it over the network, and you can encrypt the pipe between the client and the server using SSL. You can go and have a look at that. So this submits to the login action in the home controller. So we can go and have a look at that as well. So that's the home controller, and this is the login function. So the login function receives a username and a password, which is just the form submission like I showed you now. It's that username and that password, and that just goes through as parameters to that function. The first thing we do then is to hash the password, and then which we do with this function that I'll explain to you now. and then we get the user from the database where the user email is equal to the username that was sent from the front, and the user password is equal to the hash of the password that was sent from the front or from the view. If the user is not null, that means it found a user with that username and that password, and then if it is null, then it redirects back to the index page with the error code. The index page should actually interpret that and say, give a message to the user saying that the login was unsuccessful. You'll see from this that you also need to ensure that the usernames are unique, and that you'll do when you register users. So I'll explain the rest of this to you now. I wrote a function to the SHA-256 hash called compute SHA-256. This kind of function you can easily Google, and a lot of people have implemented this on Stack Overflow. But it just uses the SHA-256 library, which forms part of the cryptography library, which you just need to include at the top of your class or your controller class. You then use that library to compute the hash, but that gets brought back in bytes, so you have to create a string from that to return. This you can just simply copy and paste from the internet. That function is then used to hash the password sent from the front, and that gets the user based on that. So if it's not null, then we create a new instance of the user view model, which I'll show you now, and then it assigns the user that we got to the user in that view model. That view model has a couple of functions that we use to do security. One of them is refresh GUID, which I'll show you now, and then this assigns it to storage, which makes it accessible to all the other functions inside your project. This then redirects the user to the index page of the owner's controller. So let's go into this class to have a look what are all the necessary functions there. So the public user is the user that was just assigned from the front. Then there's a refresh GUID function. The GUID is a token we use to send back and forth between the client and the server, and this is the unique token that identifies users. This token needs to be unique, so we need to check that in the database, and that is what this function is used for. So how that works is the user is assigned a new GUID and expiry time of now plus 30 minutes. That makes it expire 30 minutes from now. We then get all the GUIDs, or count all the GUIDs in the database where it is equal to the GUID that we just assigned to the user. If there are more than 0 GUIDs, that means that GUID exists in the database and it's not unique. So we call this same function again. This is called recursion, to do that process again, and this will continue until that is not the case. So if that is not the case, then we update all of the we update the user with the new GUID that is unique, and we save the changes to the database. This function is called every time you need to refresh the GUID, which I prefer to do on every request. I've then written two functions that check whether the user's logged in, and these are overloaded functions. So the first one only has one parameter, which is the database context of the model, and then the second one takes two parameters. So if this function is called with only one parameter, it will hit this one, and if it's called with two parameters, this one will be hit. So this one is for the case where the user in this class has been assigned, and you can simply use that to check whether the user is logged in. You check whether that user is logged in by looking at the user's GUID, if that exists, and the expiry time of that GUID is later than now. If that is the case, then the user is logged in, so you return true, and if that's not the case, then the user is not logged in, so you return false. The second function accepts a user GUID as a string, as a parameter. In this case, the user has not been assigned to this class because the function did not have the user. In this case, we get the user with the user GUID that was sent and check whether the expiry date in the database or expiry time in the database is later than now. We get that user and assign them to the user in this class. So if this user is not null, that means we found a user that is valid and the user is logged in, so we return true, and otherwise we return false. I will show you now where these functions are used. So the first function that is hit after logging in is the index action of the owner's controller. So if we go to the owner's controller, we can inspect the code that I wrote there. So I get the user from temporary storage like I stored it in the home controller there. I gather it and then change its type to the user VM type. I then check whether the user is logged in, and seeing as I have a user view model object which has a user in it defined here, I can call the first function. So the isLoggedIn function that is called here is only called with the DB entities. So the function that is called is this one. I do not need to call this one as the user object here is already defined. So this check if the user is logged in, and if that's the case, then it returns a view there with the owner view model. The first thing it needs to do is refresh the GUID, and the reason for that is that you want to do that with every request from the database. The owner view model includes a user view model because we need to send the GUID to the front. So we send this to the view with the user view model, and the view extracts the GUID, which is then used to do other requests. So let me show you the index file here. So the model becomes the owner VM as sent from the front, and there's a list in owner VM with all of the owners. We loop through all of the owners like we've done before, to display them like that. Just note that we'll have to change this to look at that list that is defined inside the model. This then displays a grid, which we see here, with all of the owners in the database. I've done one sample function where I send the GUID back to check whether the user has access to do the operation. So that is the details function, and then I define a GUID like that and send it as a parameter. The details function then calls the details in the owner's controller, which is this function. This function then uses again the user VM and calls the second instance of the isLoggedIn function to check whether the user is logged in. If the user is logged in, then it continues with the operation like usual. If it is not logged in, if the user is not logged in, then it returns an error code. This check is done for if someone hacks into the system and they don't have access to this function, then it will return a forbidden. This also refreshes the GUID again, which creates a new GUID in the database, and so forth. This function should then return this GUID again to the view, which will be used to create more requests. And so you send the GUID with each request, with each session to the view, and you use that GUID to make requests. You check if that GUID is valid by calling the isLoggedIn function like I created, and then if the GUID is valid, then you allow access to that function. Another function that should be added here is to check whether the user has rights in terms of his role here. So that will be a simple function that you add to this. So if you want to restrict only users of a certain role to do this, then you can add a condition to this if statement that says user this will only allow users that have a user type 1 or 2 in the database to access this function. So if we go to the user types, so if you defined, let's go and have a look under tables, user type. So for that function, it will only allow administrators and managers to do that. Super users will not be allowed to do that operation. It will then return forbidden if a super user tries to do this. You can also incorporate this into the user VM class to do that check for you. So this is the summary of user management and the way you should be thinking. It is a very short introduction. There's a lot more you can learn, more about encryption and about SSL and how to manage GUIDs. You need to send a GUID with every request to the front and to the database. So you'll need to add to this function, for example, by doing something like this. So instead of just sending the owner there, you'll need to send a view model. So we can do that like this. Oh wait, like this. We can use an owner VM. There'll just be one object in the list, which we can manage quite easily on the front. So you can say and that will send the owner to the front with the user view model. Whichever request you then do in the front further to the database, you'll send the GUID along to do user validation like we've done for this function. That is all that I want to do for this video this week. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that this was understandable. User management can become complex. This is just a basic introduction.